Hi, everyone. So today I wanted to address a vegan talking point that comes up in some of the comments. Here's one example of that comment. So, quote, I love when they bring up a society of people whose majority typically didn't live past their 30s as a reason to go carnivore or eat more meat. Forget all the studies that prove the more plant-based your diet is, the less cholesterol you eat, the longer you live. Now, okay, that's the comment. The second part of that comment is something that we've addressed elsewhere. We've talked about the failures of epidemiology and so on, the limitations of food frequency questionnaires. But that first part is something that's coming up a lot, so I just want to address it now. When we are talking about human longevity, there's a tendency to assume that we're living longer now than we have at any point in history. And by and large, that's true. But what about humans in prehistory? Do we live longer than humans did, say, 30,000 years ago? And the short answer to that is that we do not know. No one currently living was there. The fossil record is very difficult to piece together and largely hasn't been studied in a way that would answer the question. One thing that we do know is that early humans were long-lived, right? They may not have lived as long as we live today, although I think there's reason to think they may have lived that long, and we can sort of look at some of that in a minute. But even so, humans lived longer than other primates, and it's not really clear why, right? There's something called the grandmother hypothesis in anthropology, which basically says that it was useful for early humans to have older people around to take care of kids while the parents did the work. I don't actually find that theory a particularly good explanation of longevity. Some animals, like for example, whales, they just live a long time, and we don't have particularly good explanations for why that's the case, right? Some whales that live a long time are solitary, some are social. Bowhead whales, which are the longest lived mammal, they tend to be solitary. They tend to not be in groups so much. So I don't think the grandmother hypothesis is particularly convincing. Anatomically speaking, humans have not changed in 300,000 years. That fact is not seriously disputed, although there are some smaller things that have happened in the last 300,000 years that might indicate some small changes to the human anatomy. For example, like the development of language, which is thought to have led to some changes in our vocal cords. Let me also bring up this paper here, this article here. This is a BBC article that goes over some of the data. What this article is, it's arguing that the lifespan of humans, as opposed to life expectancy, which is a statistical construct, hasn't really changed much at all. What does that mean? Life expectancy means, if you're living through a time of famine, for example, a lot of people are going to die very young. A lot of children are going to die. There's going to be high infant mortality and so on. Or if you're living in an age of agriculture, where there's a lot of diseases coming into the population, or if you're living in an age of very poor hygiene, that means that a lot of people will die young, right? So that'll be your life expectancy. That'll change. That's when most people say they were only living until their 30s. They're referring to life expectancy. They're not referring to lifespan. So lifespan of humans, there's no evidence that that's changed. So just like we have 100, 120-year-old people today, not very common, but possible. The thinking is that we had 120-year-old people even at that point in time. When we look at this in more detail, and we look at what are the things that have allowed for an increase in life expectancy, again, not lifespan, lifespan is more or less the same. What has allowed for the increase in life expectancy? It's things like hygiene, it's things like vaccines to some extent, it's things like refrigeration. That's what's mostly increased the life expectancy. And when I'm talking about prehistory, just remember that a lot of that is not relevant. In prehistory, humans were living in much smaller groups, much further away, a little bit more isolated and so on. So the hygiene stuff was less relevant. Refrigeration would have been less relevant. Probably humans were eating more fresh food. There's lots of evidence in history of people living a long, long time. People died in their 70s, people died in their 80s, people who we think died more than at more than 100 years of age. So this particular line, like we shouldn't pay attention to older societies, that's not a reason not to pay attention to older societies. Given what I said in the beginning, right? So anatomically speaking, humans haven't changed in 300,000 years. So isn't it a relevant question to ask what were humans doing 300,000 years ago? Why would that be irrelevant? Like under what circumstances could that possibly be irrelevant? And the answer is that, of course, it's not irrelevant. It's the default human diet. Super important. And if you want to argue against a default human diet, maybe there are several default human diets. That's a different discussion. But if you want to argue that, no, we shouldn't eat what we eat in nature, we should eat supplements and processed foods and so on, you need a lot of evidence to be able to make that case. And I don't think anyone has that evidence. So that's it for today. Thanks for listening. We'll see you in the next one.